Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Jenna Kelly, and I hope this conversation finds you well wherever you are listening today. And I kind of hope you're sitting down for this one so that you can really take it in, because it is such an important conversation where we are talking about adoption. And I'm sitting down with three guests, which is the first for me, but it was so important to have three guests because they represent the three voices and lived experiences of an adoption process. So we've got Sara Easterly, who is the author of books and essays, including her multi-award winning memoir, Searching for Mom. She is the founder of Adoptee Voices and a trained facilitator and staff member with the Neufeld Institute. So Sara is an adoptee and is speaking from that perspective. And then we have Kelsey Vander Vliet Ranyard, who is a birth mother and a passionate advocate for adoption reform. She's the policy director at a nonprofit that works on private adoption policy issues and co-hosts the Birth Mom podcast, Twisted Sisterhood. So Kelsey is speaking from the perspective of a birth mom. And then we have Holden, who is an adoptive parent and adoption educator and is mom to two young adults. She writes at lavenderluz.com and is the author of the acclaimed book, The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption, and hosts of the podcast Adoption, The Long View. And so the three of them have come together to write this amazing new book called Adoption Unfiltered, Revelations from Adoptees, Birth Parents, Adoptive Parents, and Allies. And this book should be a mandatory read for all of those that are impacted by adoption, which is a lot of us. And so as I was preparing for this interview, I really felt the weight and the nervousness of really wanting to do this topic justice and the beauty and the nuance and the advocacy, all the things that this topic needs. And so, of course, we're not going to do that all in 1 hour, but we really tried. And we got to hear from each of them on really important aspects of the adoption process. They have so many resources in this new book too. And we'll also link their websites and other things in the show notes so that you guys can check this out and hopefully check out the book as well. So I hope you enjoy and learn as much as I did from this conversation. Well, hello, Sara, Kelsey, and Lori. I am sending each of you the warmest welcome. Thank you so much for joining me in conversation today.
Thank you for having us. We're delighted to be here.
Yes, it's truly my honor. We're going to be talking about the adoption experience and also bringing in the lens of attachment, because how can we not talk about adoption without bringing in attachment, which helps us make sense of the adoption experience, including the grief and the loss that is inherent in adoption. And the three of you wrote this amazing new powerful book, Adoption Unfiltered, Revelations from Adoptees, Birth Parents, Adoptive Parents, and Allies. And this book is such a gift, and I can't wait for us to talk more about the book too. And this is also the first for me. I've never had three guests on at once, and I truly couldn't think of a more fitting reason and topic to have the three of you here. So the three of you represent the voices and the lived experiences of the perspective of adoptee, Sara, the birth mother, Kelsey, and the adoptive mother, Lori. And I know there's so many other voices that are important in the adoption experience, but the fact that the three of you came together to write this powerful book, and I know you guys have done many other things together, podcasts, video series, this is so needed. And I don't know why it should be so revolutionary. Like, we should be bringing these three voices together much more often. But I'm so glad that the three of you came together to write this book and to share from your own voices and lived experiences. It's really, really needed. So much like the book, where you set it up from the perspective first of the adoptee and then the birth parent and then the adoptive parent, I'm going to start with you, Sara, as the adoptee voice. And I would invite you to please share an attachment memory that feels really important to you and the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And Thanks, Jenna, for that really kind, your kind words about the book too. You got me ready to cry. I'm tearing up already because it's just really deeply meaningful when people who aren't necessarily living adoption get it and understand it, and it just means a lot. So thank you for that. In terms of an attachment memory, I have two that pop in my mind. If it's okay if I share both, and they kind of contrast with each other. But one of them, I was a young girl, and I'm the adoptee, and my parents in their era, they were really wonderful parents. I want to start with that, but they also weren't given great advice for parenting, let alone for raising an adoptee. And they were always kind of going with the parenting trends, and sleep training was one of them. And I remember as a young girl sleeping outside their locked door. They wanted me to stay in my bed, and I would wake up every morning on the floor with their door shut, and I'm laying there asleep. And I didn't really have access to that memory until I myself became a parent, and I was kind of commiserating with my mom about, how do I get my daughter to stay in her bed all night? She keeps crawling into bed with us. And my mom kind of laughed like, oh, yeah, we used to find you, outside the door every morning when we woke up. And I remember I hadn't really remembered it until she said it. And then I definitely remembered it. And it was like, wow, that explains a lot. And, here I had been at the time I said that, I had already been in this deep dive of attachment as a new parent, because I wanted to do I wanted to get it all right. And I didn't even have consciousness yet of all that hadn't been right. But as soon as she said that and jogged my memory, I was like, oh, this is why I am so drawn to attachment, because I knew that was a really big problem for I wouldn't do it to my children, and they're not adopted. And I was adopted already full of and saturated with separation. And so I could just really I had so much loss that I had to feel in that moment over that. And the other attachment memory that I wanted to share in contrast to that is, because there's that laughing that my mom did that was hurtful too, and kind of dismissing and everything. But I also, in high school, I got into, I had adolescent energy bubbling up, a lot of identity formation, and identity is quite complicated for adoptees, and going through a hard time. And I don't even remember what I did. I probably crashed my car or skipped school and got in trouble, something. And my mom left a note on my car that said, "I love you anyway." And I was in so much trouble. I remember I was grounded. I was all but I had a note on my car, "I love you anyway." And the power of that message of, no matter what you do, I still love you, was deeply meaningful. So those are the two that come to mind.
Thank you. I love how you contrasted that, both the separation trauma and the way you said it, so being so saturated already in separation, and then having that visceral memory of sleeping outside your parents' door. And then also hearing that message that all children need to hear, but I'm sure, especially as an adoptee in that moment where it's like, oh, was this bad enough that I could get separated again or abandoned again? And to have that message from your mom that I love you anyway. So such powerful memories. So thank you for bringing more of you into this conversation, and for bringing so many adoptee voices into this conversation. And I know you said in the book that you all wanted to start with the adoptee voice. Could you share more about why that was so important?
Yes. Well, the adoption is supposed to be centered around the needs of the child first and foremost. And for the last many decades, when we talk about adoption, it's not usually those conversations are not led by adoptees. We're making headway on that for sure. But professionals and adoptive parents have dominated the narrative of adoption. And it's all from their perspective. It's centering them. It's highlighting them. It's presenting this beautiful story of adoption, usually because the parents and the professionals are getting something from it. But and it's not to say that the children aren't getting something from it, but it comes with a lot of loss. Adoption is founded on loss and separation, and so it's pretending that doesn't exist, and it's a lot of gaslighting that happens as a result, and just a hard experience to live in when you have loss and grief that needs to be expressed, and it doesn't feel like there's an invitation to express it. So we wanted to center adoptees first and foremost. And then a very close second to that is birth parents, because birth parents' voices have not really been a part of the conversations either. Adoptees have been taking the mic back for the last, 8 years or so. And we're now seeing more and more birth parents taking the voice as well. And so it rounds out the picture. It shows the just immense complexity of adoption when everybody's talking.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm so glad you're helping to elevate the voices of adoptees. And when we think about attachment, that's really what we want to think about, is how do we strengthen secure attachments for adoptees? And if we're not elevating their voices and helping them make sense of the loss and their stories, then we're really missing the mark. You have a quote on page 39 in the book that says, in addition to losing agency and voice, many adoptees feel powerlessness from the ways their parents take over their stories and share their own versions of their child's adoption stories without consent. And that really speaks to what you were just saying. So taking your voice and your agency back.
Yeah. And I think which I write about in the book as well, is I think what happens is, and you touched on this, I think there's a deep-seated fear that we might be sent away. We've already lost one mother. Are we going one set of parents? Are we going to lose another set of parents? And so there's a lot of compliancy and people pleasing. And so it affects the authenticity of a relationship when there's not space to share your true self, because that true self might not be invited and could be sent away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you talk about the gaslighting and that experience of already feeling othered as an adoptee. And then the adults around you often like, but what do you mean? Everything's fine. And you're lucky you were chosen, all of those well-intentioned. And I'm sure Lori will probably get to this too when we talk from the adoptive parent perspective, but so well-intentioned, but that doesn't mean that it lands in the way that's really going to help build healthy identity and secure attachment. The other thing I love about this chapter, this part of the book, the first part of the book from the adoptee perspective, is that you bring in such diverse perspectives of adoptees, and also bring in, transracial adoptees and intercountry adoptees, and not just those that were adopted at birth, but that were, also potentially in foster care and adopted later. And just want to know what that was like, Sara, as you were interviewing these adoptees and the lessons that you learned from their experience as well.
Oh gosh, I really enjoyed the process of the interviews, I have to say. We interviewed 50 others for the book, 50 others altogether. Out of the 50, 23 were adoptees, or adopted people, I was going to say. And 18 were birth parents, and then the balance were adoptive parents, as well as some allies, some people who chose not to adopt. I could have gone so much deeper, but we spent so much time on these interviews. It was hard to cut off. I'm really fortunate. I run the Adoptive Voices writing groups, and I founded that about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago. And basically what I'm doing in these groups is helping to support other adoptees in sharing their stories. So I have heard thousands of stories at this point through the groups. And so there is a way that nothing shocks me anymore. I feel like I've heard so much, and yet every single adoptee has a very unique story. And they're all unique. So I really was trying to tap into, my knowledge of that, my awareness of that, and go as deep as possible in terms of diversity, and showing all different kinds of experiences, and it was hard to cut that off because I could have, I kept, every time I met somebody, I'm like, oh, I want to interview you. But what I realized was that it wasn't my job to tell their stories. That's theirs to tell.
Mm-hmm.
What I needed to do was synthesize, now take it up to what is the broader story here? What is this? What are all these dynamics? What, most of the people I interviewed have they haven't studied attachment. They haven't looked at it. So they just tell me their experiences. They were just vulnerably sharing. And when adoptees get together, we just lay our hearts on the table. I mean, it happens instantly. I mean, there's just this immediate understanding of each other that we don't need the words. We know, we know all the stuff, and you just go really deep, really fast. And so I was really honored that they had the trust in me to do that. And so I came from this place of, I really wanted to honor them and not pathologize, not make them wrong, but explain them to them, explain adoptees to them, and then explain adoptees to other people who so often misunderstand us, with the, diagnoses like reactive attachment disorder. And so my framework always just kept coming back to attachment. When I mentioned when my children were born, I, on this quest, started studying attachment and child development through the Neufeld Institute and Dr. Gordon Neufeld's work. And so, what immediately came to me was just visualizing the primal, what he describes as the primal emotions of separation that's too much to bear, unbearable separation. And so once I kind of, that clicked in place for me, I was like, okay, I was just color coding all my interview transcripts and realizing, okay, this is pursuit, this is defensive attachment, this is frustration, and just that attacking energy that results coming out of frustration when it's too much. Here's anxiety and alarm, and look at all the stuff we have to be alarmed about. And so it really crystallized for me, and really felt somewhat magical, actually, because it's just understanding humans at that point.
Yeah. And normalizing the experience when, like we said earlier, so much of that experience is minimized, dismissed, or the narrative is taken over by others. And so to finally have this framework of attachment and to connect with other adoptees who have been through similar lived experiences and also unique experiences, that how normalizing that must have felt as a human being, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I say often, I grew up, I say I grew up in isolation. I actually did grow up with two adoptees that we were very close family friends, but we never talked about adoption. And we didn't talk about it in my family. We didn't, I didn't feel comfortable bringing it up if it did come up. And so I was in my head a lot. I grew up really having a lot of really dark secret thoughts, wondering if I was crazy, if something was deeply wrong with me. I mean, I kept it all inside. That carried on through adulthood, and to learn about attachment and be like, no, this is just normal. This is how humans respond when there's so much separation. It's definitely normalizing, and then and so that is a big passion of mine, is making sure adoptees don't feel that way. It's just we're just responding how our brains were designed to respond.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk more about your experience and your journey with your birth family and how that expanded your understanding of your own attachments?
Yeah. So I had, my memoir details a lot of stuff, and part of it is my journey to find my birth mom. Kind of my journey of becoming a new mother and going on this quest to become the perfect mother, and studying attachment from that desire that was, pretty neurotic and not feasible either. But that journey to accept that was coinciding with realizing that I wanted to search for my birth mother, because it had been a closed adoption. And then it also coincided with my adoptive mother dying. So there was a lot of stuff happening all at once, just a lot of emotional a lot of emotional stuff to unpack all simultaneously. And so I was going through all of that. I found my birth mother. We reunited. I found out that the circumstances around my adoption, it was a private gray market adoption. And I grew up kind of, I've always been a writer. So I thought it was kind of an exciting sounding, interesting thing. And then I found out, no, that means, in my case, it meant there were some just not okay, not ethical practices, which a lot of us find out that tends to be a part of a lot of our journeys, is learning that. So I had a big arc of kind of a loyalty. It really was a loyalty, not a test, but it felt like it definitely put me in this divided loyalty of, feeling a lot of compassion and loyalty to my birth mother for the experiences that she went through. It was a coerced adoption. She didn't have a voice. She didn't feel empowered to speak up and to even tell anybody after the coercive situation happened. And then putting pieces together of finding out more about myself. So I definitely had some forgiving to do of my adopted mother, and she was dying. So there was a ticking clock that I kind of had to go through that exercise faster than I probably would have otherwise. So there was a lot there that was significant. And then just the realization that a lot of adoptees come to too. There's just so much grief and loss. I just saw an American Idol has an adoption reunion story that took place on the show, where they televise, and we've all seen them, the happy, again, this is part of the problem with the narrative, is they show these happy reunions, and the producers, it looked like, had arranged the reunion for her, this adoptee who was performing on the show, a contestant, and they arranged a reunion for her backstage, and she goes back there, and I'm thinking, that's only a sliver of it, because what never is shown is what happens when you've lost. I mean, in my case, it was 40 years. And how do you can't just drop into a family. We know attachment and how relationships build and grow, and they need, they're designed the way they're designed, with, attaching through sameness, and then through, through going deeper in attachment. And that doesn't happen when you're just dropped into reunion. So it's really complicated relationships. And that was the case for me too. Just I found that I was welcomed, which doesn't always happen. But I was welcomed, and that was fantastic. But there's just so much loss that it brings up. And then also the sliding doors feeling of, what if I had been there, and you start filling in your life, and who would I be? And it's just hard to even make sense of who would I be, because I'm this person. Lori and I were even just, when we were on our tour, Lori, you asked me a question, about something about if I would still be, I'm really empathetic to animals. And she said, do you think you'd always have that? And I'm like, my birth family are hunters. And I don't know if I'm an animal person because I'm adopted, or if I would have been that way anyway. I don't know. I have no pre-adoption personality whatsoever. So it's complicated to unpack all of that. And, this is now, I've been in reunion for 11, or maybe coming up on 12 years, and I'm still unpacking that, and those are the stories that don't make it on those happy reunion shows.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's complicated. If that's one thing that your book reminds us of, and yet also helps distill it down to some really practical applications too, which I appreciate. But it's complicated, and it's a lifelong journey and healing and work. But there's things that we know better now, hopefully. And I'm sure we'll talk about that too, so that we can lessen that burden on the adoptees more and support this complicated journey in more attachment informed ways, so that maybe they're not waiting till like you were when you were 40 to really start going on this discovery process for yourself. So thank you for sharing so vulnerably, and for the contributions you're making to the field of adoption. The other part of the book that I want to touch on, and then I love to bring Kelsey into this conversation, and I know this is one we could spend the whole hour talking about as well. But I really appreciate that you all talked about just the systemic problems that are inherent in adoption too, and the chapter, the tentacles of classism and racism in adoption. And like I said, bringing in the voices of so many different lived experiences and transracial adoptees. And you have a quote on page 88 from Kayla, an adoptee, who said, "I recognize that my adoptive parents love me to the best of their ability. However, they can only love me to the extent of their white supremacy." And so as we talk about this complicated journey that you just shared so much from your own story of, and then we think about the way that race and culture compound that journey, that it's a whole nother layer of trauma, and way to be othered, and things that the system and that the caregivers need to really be holding in mind. So is there something you can share that you learn? I mean, I'm sure there's so much you could share, but maybe one important really lesson around how not only to support adoptees, but to support transracial adoptees?
Yeah, I think, definitely Kayla just spoke at one of our events in Chicago last week while we were on book tour, and she shared about that too. And I think, a lot of the quotes from the book are coming to mind all at once. Another one is from Susan Devon Harness, who talks about anytime you adopt someone from another race, you and have that kind of saviorism perspective, you are putting them down a rung on the ladder. And I didn't get her quote exact. She says it really beautifully, but there's a lot of inherent judgment, and that tends to be with all adoption across the board. But there's added judgment that from when we were talking about white adoptive parents adopting a child of another race, that they're less than. And there's a lot of color blindness of all you need is love, and love will conquer all, and a lot of not healthy beliefs that don't recognize the whole person who the adoptee is, because they come from a different culture, they come from different parents, they come from different situations, and they need to be recognized and seen as their whole selves. And roots do matter. Connections, those first connections to our birth families do matter. Our ancestral stories, our origin stories, those are all deeply important to shaping our identity. So I think it just in terms of just knowing racial education is very important. We talk about that in our final chapter, that's a really important piece, and just understanding all of the dynamics that go hand in hand with it. I know in the communities I'm in with adoptive parents raising transracial adoptees, there's some real complexity, because just being seen with your parents is sharing your adoption story. And adoptees have a fierce need to belong. I mean, like all humans do, like that, that's one of the levels of attaching that we do. And so that right there just shows the world that you don't belong. So there's a lot of complexity and understanding that needs to be, going hand in hand. And I liked what you said earlier about the book. I mean, we do consider this book informed consent for adoptive parents and for birth parents, anyone considering adoption, of what it's like on the inside, and how important it is to understand all these facets.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing a couple of really important lessons around that. And I want to bring in that birth parent perspective now. So Kelsey, would like to invite you more into this conversation and to see if there's an attachment memory that you would feel comfortable sharing that really feels important to you and to the work that you're doing.
Sure. I remember when we were writing the book, and I remember because we would write a chapter and then we would have each other read our chapters. And Sara, obviously, so like, I mean, her chapters on attachment were and it was just really woven throughout all of her chapters. But I don't know like the ins and outs of attachment theory like Sara does, but so my chapters were much more just talking about the experience without necessarily connecting it to theory. But I remember saying to Lori and Sara that there was so much of a theme of attachment with adoptive parent section and adoptee section, and all I could think about was detachment for mine because I didn't have such a present role. And so I feel like I don't know if I have a specific attachment memory, but I do have these themes that kind of carry on through my open adoption relationship where I don't know, I feel like my child and I are two magnets that live on opposite sides of the country. And I feel like when we get together, we get to magnetize but that separation of the magnets is really tough and because it's not always easy to pull two magnets apart. And so I feel like that separation can be really painful. But there's also that tethering to one another that is the closer you get together, the more you can attach. And so that's mine, I guess, if that counts.
Of course, they all count. And yeah, it's complicated. Again, that'll be the theme of our talk. And that was one of my questions, which you've already touched on, Kelsey, is just how navigating that when you make the choice to give a child up for adoption, how that impacts your view of attachment, because there is that level of detachment that you talked about, and also that strong magnetic pull and emotional pull with your child that you've placed into adoption and what that's like to navigate. And so sharing voice to that is so important. The other thing you talked about is open adoption. And on page 140 in the book, it says, holding the belief that open adoption is a courtesy to the birth mother is a fair indicator of a fundamental misunderstanding of openness, and in turn, the ignorance of the magnitude of the role adoption plays in the life of an adoptee. So I wonder if you could speak more to this misunderstanding that with an open adoption, it's like we're just doing the birth parent this favor, and what that actually is like to have an open adoption, and most importantly, the impact for the adoptee.
Sure. Well, I think we often get it wrong in pre-adoption education, whether we're talking to the parents, the adoptive parents, or the birth parents, expectant parents. We do present it as a favor to both sides, a privilege and a favor, to be able to continue contact. And a lot of times it's mainly used that way in marketing, like, don't worry, it's not like you won't see your child ever again. And we kind of harken back to like the post-war baby scoop era, and like they didn't get that, but you can because we're so modern. And so I think when we really strictly use it in that marketing sense, we miss it completely. And so and also the marketing of it is so highly inaccurate because we don't enforce open adoption agreements in every state, and the stakes are so high, and the accessibility is tough as well to get your open adoption agreement, if you have one, to get it enforced in the first place. So, but Lori speaks really well to the difference between openness and the contact in open adoption. But for my side, the contact is a pretty relevant piece, because the contact is with me. So that's the level of contact that we're really valuing. I'm sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought. Man, the lights are on, but nobody's home. Hold on.
Kelsey, can I throw something in as long as this isn't on? You might, sometimes I've heard you talk about how a favor means like you're treating the adoptee as a gift.
Yeah. And so, okay. So when we talk about open adoption as a favor, I think it's looking through a transactional lens as like, I gave this child as a gift when that's not at all what I did. You don't give people as gifts. That's highly problematic and bizarre. And so we often hear from adoptive parents when they're like, how, I have to give this mom contact. She gave me the greatest gift. And I'm like, didn't do that. And also, you can't pay someone back for that. That's not, we have to like totally reframe and go through a different lens. And so we look at open adoption through, we need to look at open adoption through the lens of centering the child and the child's needs. And so when we look at open adoption as more of a relationship and an element of how to help this child feel whole, it changes everything. I'm not there, just because you're letting me come and see them. I'm also, our connection is really valuable for me and for him. And so, I can answer questions that they can't. I can give, some background information and context to help him understand his story. I think all of those things are really important, not always accessible, but really important when they are accessible to keep that contact there and that relationship healthy.
Yes. Helping support the wholeness of the child that's the adoptee. I love that, Kelsey. But again, it's complicated. And I wonder, what supports did you have to support your own processing, your own grief? And what supports does the adoptee family need in this open adoption experience?
Yeah, well, I think I didn't have a ton. I started working in an agency a year after placement, which was like way too soon to be working in adoption. However, what I worked for an agency that was really committed to being progressive and wanting to change. And so wanted to change their practices and how they looked at things and everything. And so I got lucky in the sense that I got to be surrounded by a bunch of progressive social workers who also really cared about me as a human being. And I didn't go through that agency for my adoption. So these were fresh faces, people that were committed to making things better and wanted my input, and also were committed to helping me become, find some sort of peace and healing as well. That's kind of obscure, right? That's not normal. And so we're not going to have everybody go work in an agency. I don't think that's a good idea. But I think like therapy is if you can find a therapist that understands these issues and adoption issues and how they relate to grief and loss for the birth family, I think that's really positive. And also like an element of, I don't know, like conflict negotiation or something like that. Like somebody that understands the complexities of the relationship, the power dynamics that are inherent in the relationship, to help moms move through that. There's every reflex in the world is telling you, especially in the very beginning, to run for the hills with this relationship. It's so uncomfortable, especially when you feel like we're all walking on eggshells around each other. And I think that that's a normal thing in the beginning, because this is an odd arrangement. It's not commonly found in our society. And so, if someone were there to help me, and somebody was, I could go back to the agency and bounce things off of these professionals, right? Like, but if someone were there for every person who's placed, that can tell them how to communicate openly and honestly, and also tell the parents how to communicate open and honestly, and how to take it from my side. think that's a tough thing, is the power dynamics of the relationship. There's a lot of fear on both sides, but somebody to help you work through that fear, communicate, and be committed to, the benefits of what this relationship can truly bring for that child, that connection, committed to that larger goal. Because sometimes the conflict is tough and it's so personal. And so it's when your brain is telling you to split the scene, it would be wonderful if we could have somebody just being like, just hang in there, because it's worth it, because that child needs that. So.
Yeah, you said it so beautifully in the book on page 127. In a perfect world, the entire experience of relinquishment and adoption would not exist. However, in a slightly better world, the adoption, mental health, and healthcare professionals would work to create infrastructure to mitigate the negative outcomes of postpartum depression, PTSD, and complicated grief, and provide accessible mechanisms for healing. And I think that's what you are speaking to, Kelsey, is that we need more professionals who understand or provide more awareness and education and opportunities for healing. Like, this is not going to feel comfortable all the time, and it's going to feel messy, and you're going to want to run away. And these are some things we can do to support you through that process, because it is going to make a difference in the life of your child. So I appreciate you sharing so openly and vulnerably and elevating the perspective of the birth parent and talking about the fear, the power dynamics. And I know, just so our listeners and viewers understand, that Kelsey does have to leave early. So I want to give you the chance to say anything else before you hop off.
Anything?
Yes.
That's really broad. I don't know. Do you have anything like specific?
Maybe advice for a birth parent who is navigating the adoption process.
Yeah, I always tell, so my birth mom friends, there's some that their contact has diminished over the years, and they always want to know, what do I need to do to preserve what little I have left, or to ask for more, or to open that conversation. And I'm always, be persistent with grace, and with gentility when necessary, and just keep asking. I have a good friend who was on one of our panels for our tour and in our book, and the adoption closed on her without her input. Of course, that's typically how it happens. And when her child was pretty young, and then at a certain age, when there were a lot of questions coming up, they came back to her and said, we shouldn't have done that, or we need you to answer some questions for him. And I think that we don't realize what this child needs when they're not really able to verbalize it.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that there are no needs. And so I think a good piece of advice is to trust the process and trust the natural flow of maturity. Because I wasn't prepared for questions happening at 5, but they were coming whether I was prepared or not. So the persistence is key, and the trust in that the journey will change, good or bad, but you have to be ready for that, and adaptable. So
trust the process. Thank you. Thank you, Kelsey, for your needed voice in this. So grateful for you sharing yourself. So Lori, I'd love to invite you more into this conversation. And same thing, if I could please invite you to share an attachment memory that feels really important to you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, first I want to just thank you for having us here, and the questions you're asking, and being able to listen to Sara and Kelsey. I never get tired of it, and going under deeper and deeper levels of hearing their words and their ideas. But when you said attachment, I had a really strong memory that came to me, that which is actually kind of about detachment and separation, but it does work its way around. A few years ago, I was on my yoga mat at the beginning of a class, and I don't exactly remember what the Dharma talk was or what the prompt was, but within about 10 breaths, I became a little girl, maybe 4 or 5, and I was in a cold, dark, damp place, and I was being stabbed with things and not fed, and my parents walked away from me. And that was maybe 5 breaths. The other 5 breaths was me thinking, oh, I know what this is. This is when I was 5 years old. I had pneumonia and I had to go into a oxygen tent in a hospital. And these were in the days when parents couldn't stay and my parents had to walk away. And I was getting stabbed with things, and it's just, and it was cold and dank and damp and dark, and it was just awful. So that memory coming up let me see an old thing when I was powerless with older eyes, where I have power. And I talked with my parents about it. And of course I confirmed that it was as hard for them to walk away as it was for me to be walked away from. Maybe even more. I can't imagine now as a parent having to leave your child when they're so bereft. And I kind of took my power back and neutralized that, and reattached to myself, I guess. So that's the powerful memory that came up for me.
Yes, quite powerful. And I can see the parallel to your memory and the journey of an adoptive parent, where so much of being an adoptive parent has to do with tending to ourselves and looking at our own attachments. And I wonder if you could speak more to your journey as an adoptive parent, Lori, and what you've learned about yourself and the healing that you needed so that you could show up in a way that is most present and healthy for your adopted children.
Yeah, and just to put a point on that memory, it's also making me recall that it was such a formative experience. Even today, as Sara and Kelsey will tell you, from traveling together, I cannot stand the thought of being left behind. I always have to be ready for the next thing. That happened in our writing, that happens in our travel. I have this fear of being left behind. So that has followed me, and now it makes more sense. I think I didn't think I needed a whole lot of knowledge about attachment, because I had great parents, I had a great childhood, but I had never really looked at it all and found some of these unattended to wounds that were obviously driving me anyway. And I thought that the way I was parented would be fine for my kids. And some of those methods included separation-based discipline, timeouts, taking things away, addressing behavior instead of, looking what's beneath the behavior. What is the behavior a signal for? So, I'm kind of lucky in that one of my children was not going to let that happen without some examination. And so we needed to find new ways. And I got a lot of support from some really amazing attachment therapists. I think probably on some level I drew Sara and her experience to me to fill in and make sense of things that weren't making sense to me. One of the things I really love in our book, in her section, is the frustration traffic circle, which talks about how that energy of not being able to get what you want comes from not being able to feel the grief, and how we look for exits out of this traffic circle. And if we don't find them through feeling it or accepting it, it comes out in a frenetic way, in anger ways towards ourselves or towards others. So it's been a long journey for me. Well, not as long as for Sara. It's been probably 10 or 15 years that I got the call that I had to figure out different ways of being more connectable to my children, for my children.
You say you got the call. What was that really woke you up to that?
It was a child in distress, and none of the tools in my toolkit that I had were working. And figuring out that it wasn't about tools anyway. It was about how I show up
Mm.
how whole I can feel, how adequate I can feel. And when were the times when I needed my kids to make me feel okay, to make me feel like a good mom. And that's ongoing. I'm not there. But I have more of a practice of self-check at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Parenting will do that in general, but I think especially as an adoptive parent that there's more layers to that. And I love that you talk in the book about the healing and the grief work that often comes hand in hand for adoptive parents too. And that may be grieving infertility issues and the inability to conceive a biological child for some adoptive parents. And, maybe thinking that once I have this child, that's going to solve all of that and heal all of that. And I'm sure you can say now that that there was much more work to be done, but did you have that awareness in the moment?
No, it was also a gradual dawning on me. It was one of the top three most exhilarating, two of the top three most exhilarating days of my life were the days that our children came to us. And I thought the dawn of a new day, happily ever after. And I came to it through infertility. And so it's such a common thing for women who come to, and perhaps some fathers too, come to adoption through infertility, that we get what we wanted, which is to be a parent, but we still have the infertility grief unless we feel it. So even in those early days after the euphoria, I was finally into the moms groups. I got to go do mom things and mom playgrounds and mom libraries and mom toy libraries and all this. But they were talking about birth stories, and they were talking about nursing, breastfeeding, and they were talking about all the things, and I still wasn't in that club. So it is a gradual dawning of, okay, yeah, I solved my parenting dilemma, but I'm still infertile and I will never have those experiences. And I probably ought to feel that and get some support around it so that my kids are not plugging up, they're not making me whole. They're not plugging the holes that I'm not attending to.
Mm. Yeah, so glad you had that awareness. Of course, we hope that it can come sooner rather than later, but just the power of that gradual awareness, because then that lessens the ability to place that expectation on the adoptee, right? And as we think about attachment and the story that the adoptive parent brings to that, of this expectation of you're going to solve all my grief and here you are, that then gets internalized by the adoptee, in addition to all the other things that could, the adoptees potentially internalizing around their own separation traumas and stories.
Yeah, I actually start the intro to my own podcast says something like, when you have your child in your arms, you think that's the end of the journey, but it's really just the beginning of another
Yes.
journey. And
Yes.
and it's the parenting journey, but it's also the inward looking journey. Because I think for me, who hasn't studied attachment, but parenting is a way to go through your own childhood, but as a grown up, and you find those sore spots, and you find those times that your needs weren't met, and you can either continue with that being subconscious, where it's kind of motivating you the way being left in that oxygen tent motivates me, or you can have a little bit more awareness with it and make more conscious choices around those wounds.
Mm-hmm. So important. You also talk in your part of the book about, you say you're making a bold statement that all adoptions should be open adoptions, but you also reframe what you mean by open adoptions. So can you share more about that?
Yes, when my first child was born, we fell into a really easy open adoption, and when I say that with my quote air quotes, is means contact with the birth mom, later the birth dad, and later child number two's birth mom and birth dad. And so for many years, contact was what I thought I was supposed to do, and I was arranging visits and managing visits, and we were kind of building relationships while it went on. But then things kind of get harder, as your kids get older, and there's just lots of different dynamics and lots more people having ownership in these arrangements. And I realized that sometimes contact was not the right thing, but I still wanted to be open. And it came to me one day that openness and this ability to kind of keep an open channel within me to know what's going on between my head, my heart, and my gut, self-check, and being approachable to my children, because this is a clear channel and they're not coming up against my debris. And this is ongoing. Again, this is not like you do it and you're done, but that informing the decisions I was making, because I was still the person who got to call the shots about contact, that was really more important, this openness, me being able to see what's going on within me, being able to attune with my children and try to figure out what's going on within them, and then me being able to set and patrol boundaries with their birth parents in a wise way, not in a subconscious, insecure way. That's why openness, I think, is really more the key than contact. So yes, it's a bold statement, because contact as a measure of an open adoption lets out a lot of people who are intercountry adoptions and their birth parents are on another continent, people who have come through the child welfare system and perhaps their birth family is not known, not available, not alive, perhaps incarcerated. Sometimes it's the adoptee themselves who doesn't want to have that contact. So there's lots of reasons why contact is not possible, but openness is always possible. So for every adoptive family, openness, I think, is, if I could wave my wand in adoption world, openness would be a requirement for passing a home study, or at least the willingness to get into openness, to look into openness and be open to openness.
Yeah, I really appreciate looking at it in this way of, it's a way of being, this openness. It's not a thing. It's a presence. It's a mindset. It's making space for, you talk in the book about the both and.
Yeah. And when you were saying that, Jenna, it was making me think this is not a tool. Open adoption is not a tool. It's a way of showing up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of, when you mentioned the both and, a lot of the ways that we constructed our adoption practices in the 20th century were from an either or model. You can only have one set of parents. So we're going to elevate these and we're going to marginalize or even completely eliminate these. We're going to put a wall between these two families so that the child, the adoptee in the center, can have one, but not both. And now that we know a little bit more about attachment and neuroscience and what's actually going on in the brain for a baby or a child, those attachments do matter. And we as adoptive parents and adoption professionals can help us shift into a both and heart set, where we are not threatened by the existence of another set of legitimate parents, where we can create a space that is expansive and invitational to everybody who is important to the adoptee. And if we have a problem with it, then we need to own that we have a problem with it. And we need to set our boundaries from that healthy place, not from that unhealthy place.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Amen. Okay. Interview over. But that's so important. But it takes a lot of work, and not everyone is as far along on their journeys, including the systems that support foster care and adoption. So I want to talk a little bit about, and I know Kelsey had to leave, and I know you said she's really good on the policy side of things. But so I do want to talk a little bit about the reforms and the advocacy that needs to continue to help make the adoption experience a more attachment informed process. And I also want to talk about what therapists need more of. So I guess that's kind of twofold. So wherever we want to start with that. And Sara, you're welcome to join in as well.
Yeah, we do. We write about both of those things. I guess I want to start with the therapist piece of it, if I could, if that's okay. Because it's fresh. I was just in a group talking with some other adoptees about this. Because there are a lot of therapists who proudly say that they're adoption competent or trauma informed. That's quite common. And there are, I just know for sure through the interviews of the book and the communities that I'm a part of, there are a lot of therapists who say some really hurtful things to adoptees and shut down the process. So, and either, and that ends the therapeutic relationship, or what is happening, what's getting shut down, that when they don't know to end the therapeutic relationship. So as an example, I have an adoptee friend who was doing EMDR, and the therapist said, well, I can tell your birth mom really loved you. And that's kind of a cultural script. I mean, that's a cultural script for adoption, is to say, oh, your birth mother loved you so much, she gave you away. But there's some really contorted thinking that we have to do as adoptees when we hear messages like that, because it affects our relationships. That love means leaving, and that's not usually the case. There might be a love component, and I wish Kelsey were still here, because we have bounced this around together, because I know that component is there, but it's how it's taken in for adoptees that gets really complex. And so, that's just one example. Another example that just got brought up today is just someone walking into therapy and right away being told, oh, your parents must be just such amazing people for adopting you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, you're just right off the bat labeling me as broken, labeling the parents as saviors. You've got, it was a transracial adoptee saying this. So now you're putting them down that rung of the ladder that I was referring to. So lots of problems right there. So, so it's really important for therapists to really, to truly be adoption competent, means being able to be aware of those microaggressions that we grow up hearing, and we hear them everywhere in culture. They're parroted back, and knowing just exactly what effect they have on us. So, so that's a big component. And that ties in with the reform needed in adoption. So, we do talk a lot about informed consent, and that goes all the way through the process of really true education. From my perspective as the adoptee, I just published an essay in Newsweek a week and a half ago about this, that parents need to be told that adoption will affect their child for life. And it may not be visible for a few decades. We're good at the hiding and the masking and the numbing and all the things we have to do in order to survive, and so then it may take a while, and so there's a blindsiding that can happen. So I think all around, just that helping and supporting anyone considering adopting. And the same is true for birth parents, with informed consent of that same perspective, that it will affect the child for life. Birth parents are not told that, and also the information that it will affect you for life. What Kelsey was touching on, I really appreciate working with Kelsey. And she often says, well, I've not studied an attachment theory, but she's studied an attachment and separation, and has that lived experience. So she knows that. And she's very in tune with those the highs and the lows, or just the losses, I should say, just that feeling of the magnet that she was describing, and the pulling apart and the coming together. And that's attachment, and she's feeling it and not numb to it, which is a coping skill that a lot of people have to do. So she's very versed in that, and can speak to that really well. So just in terms of just the informed consent on the emotional journey for all is a huge piece of the reform needed. And Lori, I don't know if you want to speak to some of the others, or we do write a lot about that in one of our concluding chapters.
Yeah, this is such a big question, Jenna, because this is a huge building to turn around. Building isn't right. It's just this huge semi truck that we want to turn around and have it go a different direction. Everything in our culture says that adoption is a fairy tale and it's a win-win, from the reunions that Sarah's talking about to the finally getting your baby scenes that I'm talking about, and all of that. So it's in the media, the adoption industry has been promoting it because For many of them, it is a supply and demand. I think in the early 20th century, probably for most of humankind, adoption was about finding homes for babies, and somehow we've turned that in because of supply and demand to turn it into finding babies for homes. So this is a call for adoption professionals to check their motives. It's a call for adoptive parents to vote with their dollars. We are the ones who put the coins into the machine and keep it running. So we need to be picking the ethical. We need to be doing a little more due diligence, but it's really hard because at that point you're making that decision. You don't know what you don't know. But choosing ethical and licensed agencies who have a reputation for finding homes for babies instead of the other way around. And that is an idea that came from Joyce McGuire-Pavo, who's kind of an icon in adoption circles and has been doing this kind of work for a long time. I think for therapists, for me, having therapists who could model for me some of the traits that I think adoptive parents need to have, and I want to pull from our chapter on this. Curiosity, openness, of course, compassion for birth parents, compassion for the adoptees who are in our care, kind of getting outside of ourselves and not seeing everything from a point of self-interest, a practice of self-reflection. A good therapist who can model that unlocks what's going on in adoptive parents. Leveraging adoptive parent privilege is a section that we had, and this came from a guest on my podcast who said that besides voting with our feet towards ethical licensed agencies, we can also call out media. Media is responding to our privilege, and they're giving us more of what we want. If we change what we want and we want a more realistic picture of adoption, as the joys, yes, and the sorrows too, we can call them out. We can let them know. We can, and this is changing. I don't know if you've noticed, but some of them later productions like This Is Us, they are hiring adoptees to consult on scripts. So they're getting it right more and more. And I just think, if we vote that way too, vote with our attention, vote with our dollars, vote with our feet. Those are some of the things I think we can do to make to reimagine adoption in ways that are more adoptee centered.
Thank you both. I wish we could go on, and that's what is so beautiful about this book is you go into more depth about all the things we just kind of tip of the iceberg today. And also there's a what now at the end of the book that really talks about more of everything you just mentioned, and resources for adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents. And this book, like I said, I've already recommended it to colleagues and friends and anybody who is impacted by adoption. And I'll share personally that sometimes, especially when I was younger, I think I didn't really have this awareness that I too am impacted by adoption. My dad is an adoptee, and I didn't get to know my adoptive grandparents. I never got to meet my paternal biological grandma. He later reunited with his biological dad, that I did get to meet him a couple times. But this book, reading it, is going to touch on so much personally and professionally. And so it was really a gift, as much as, I thought I knew about trauma and attachment, to help me understand my dad. And, he recently passed away in November. And so this was really a needed read on so many levels. And so I know that it's going to impact other people personally, professionally as well. So we will link all the things in our show notes, because your websites, your podcast, this book, so much of what you're doing, you guys are really moving the needle in such a meaningful and needed way. So thank you truly from the bottom of my heart for this important work that you're doing and sharing yourselves in such authentic and vulnerable ways to help do that. Is there anything you want to end us on, or anything I forgot to ask you about, or that you want our listeners and viewers to know that you're doing?
I would just like to thank you for talking with us and for bringing us to your audience. I would like to thank all the listeners here, because one of the goals we have for this book is to bring it as far upstream as we can in as part of a curriculum in social work and counseling and therapist circles, so that this stuff, we can get a lot of support and help early on in changing this win-win narrative into a more realistic view.
I want to echo that. Thanks. Really appreciate you. And I had said that you were not in the, not a part of adoption, but like we have stickers of the adoption constellation, visualization that we have on page 3 of the book. And I really, I just want to say that there's so many people touched by and affected by adoption than people are aware. And Kelsey also has a father who is an adoptee. So, there's that generational, there's the step parents, there's the teachers, the clergy, just all who may come in contact with an adoptee at any point in their entire life journey. So that kind of makes it everybody is a part of the adoption constellation, truly, once you do the the connecting. So that's nice to hear your connection to adoption. And I'm sorry for your dad's loss, and or your loss of your dad, and just really appreciate being on the show too.
Oh, thank you. It was truly my honor. And yes, it's ever reaching, the ripple effects. And so just keep up the amazing good work. And I look forward to all the ways our paths can continue to cross. So thank you both. And thank you, Kelsey, who had to leave early, for sharing yourself today on this podcast and in this conversation. I wish you all well in the future.